Introduction to Jotter and Lab Report Writing. First, the Jotter book. Before a student enters a practical session, he or she is required to prepare a Jotter. A Jotter is proof that a student has read through the laboratory manual and the instructions. To prepare a Jotter, a student needs the following: the laboratory manual, the pre-lab guidelines, a pen, an electronic calculator, and an exercise book to serve as the Jotter book. A Jotter for an experiment should have the following: a title, a date, the objectives, theory or introduction, apparatus and chemical reagents, procedures, and results. First, the title. The title for the experiment should be taken directly from the laboratory manual. Example of titles are shown as following. Next, date. The date of the experiment should be written on the top right corner of the page. Examples are shown as following. Next, the objectives. The objectives of the experiment should be taken from the laboratory manual. Examples of the objectives are shown as following. Next, theory and introduction. Students are required to summarize the introduction from the laboratory manual. Students are also encouraged to include additional information from other resources. Examples of theory or introduction is shown as following. Next, apparatus and chemical reagents. The lists should be taken directly from the laboratory manual. Examples are shown as following. Next, procedures. The procedures from the laboratory manual should be summarized into diagrams, flowcharts, etc. The following is the example of procedure written in a Jotter book. Next, results. The results from the experiment are to be recorded and tabulated in the Jotter book. If there is a datasheet provided, student can copy it into the Jotter. If there is none provided, students should create their own datasheet. Example shown is datasheet provided for one of the experiment. Next, lab report. After a student finishes a practical session, he or she is required to write a lab report. A lab report is used to explain what has been carried out and discuss the findings. To prepare a lab report, a student needs the following: the laboratory manual, the Jotter book, a pen, an electronic calculator, and a lab report template, which will be provided by the lecturer. A lab report for an experiment should have the following: the title, the objectives, theory, the procedures, the results or observations, discussion or exercises, and finally, conclusion. First, the title. The title for the experiment should be taken directly from the laboratory manual. The following shows an example of title written in a lab report. Next, the objectives. The objectives of the experiment must be stated clearly. Following shows the objectives written in a lab report. Next, theory. The theory must be written concisely in the student's own words. If necessary, a labeled diagram may be drawn. The following shows a theory written in a lab report. Next, the procedures. The procedures of the experiment must be written in passive sentences about all the steps taken during experiment. An example of an active sentence is, label a 200 milliliter beaker as tap water. The same sentence in passive is, a 200 milliliter beaker has been labeled as tap water. Let's look at another example of an active sentence. Using a thermometer, measure the temperature of the tap water. The same sentence as a passive sentence. The temperature of the tap water has been measured using a thermometer. Next, results or observations. The data obtained from the experiment must be tabulated with units and uncertainties. Data processing methods such as plotting of graphs and calculations to obtain results should also be included. The following are examples of results and observations written in a lab report. Next, discussion and exercises. To discuss the results of the experiment, students should include the following. Comments on the experimental results by comparing with standard values. State the sources of mistakes and errors, as well as any precautions taken to overcome them. Answer all the questions given. Lastly, conclusion. To conclude the report, students should briefly state the results of the experiment with reference to the objectives of the experiment. Example of conclusion in a lab report is shown as following. The end.